welcome to the Marathon Medic podcast. My name's Amy and I'm a junior doctor and running coach with an interest in sports and exercise medicine. Today, I'm joined by Dr Anthony Rafferty to discuss gut health. Anthony is a medical doctor and PhD who is passionate about improving gut microbiome health through nutrition and lifestyle. He studied for 15 years in higher education with 4 degrees to his name and almost a decade of experience in academic clinical research. He's currently training in general practice and actively involved in microbiome research and education. On this episode, we discuss the importance of good gut health for sports performance, the role that exercise plays in improving gut health, and importantly, Anthony gives advice on how we can all improve our gut microbiome. So, hello and welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for joining me. We obviously got in touch through a mutual friend who shared some of your work, and I've been following you keenly on social media and learning lots about gut health. But for the benefit of our listeners, would you mind just sharing a little bit about yourself and your background, particularly your research background as well?
Of course. Yeah. It's such a pleasure to be chatting to you. Thanks so much for getting in touch. It's always so lovely to be able to spread the microbiome word. But my name's Tony. So on social media, I'm the Good Gut Doc. And I suppose a little bit about me. I have a background initially in science. I did a science degree and I specialised in zoology. And I then went over and I did a master's in environmental management. I was really passionate about kind of environmental conservation and the oceans. And that kind of led me over to Australia, where I worked. I did my PhD over there and slowly transitioned away from kind of the marine sciences into health sciences. And it was in that role I began working with neonates or preterm birth research. And it became really evident during that time that the neonatal or the preterm baby gut was just so important. And there was loads of kind of conditions that we saw in the preterm baby gut. And I began researching things even back then to find out how the gut matured and essentially how the microbiome was kind of kick-started from an early age. And that ultimately led me back to study medicine because I just found everything so fascinating. But I maintained my research involvement in mainly preterm birth and fetal development during pregnancy. And since kind of graduating, I've been involved in microbiome research now. I mainly work in pregnancy. And I'm kind of looking at the vaginal and the gut microbiome in mothers and kind of transfer of bugs between mother and infant in newborns, which has been fantastic. So that's kind of a bit about me and my interests are kind of my strange path that's led me here.
I was about to say that was because I obviously don't know too much about your background. That was quite an unusual path, but I think it is quite nice when you don't have that plan from a really young age. I think sometimes we get sucked into one journey, but if you find it yourself, often you're a bit more passionate about the topics that you end up in, I think. So,
well, that's kind of what's led me all along the path. I just kept going towards what interested me. And, I think I'm really, really passionate now about kind of lifestyle and nutrition and the impacts that can have from a very, very early age.
Perfect. And we're going to kind of dive into gut health a bit more today and particularly try and link that to athletes and sports and exercise. Yeah. But I guess it would be a good place to start is actually just describe what we mean by gut health and the microbiome, because I think it's actually become very popular recently and we use those terms a lot, but I'm not sure that we always understand exactly what we mean by that. So what is gut health and what is the gut microbiome?
So the microbiome is completely fascinating and I just love it so much. So essentially the microbiome is a general term that we use to refer to the bugs and their genetic material that live within different kind of ecological niches within the body. So, for example, on our skin, in our ears, in our nose, in our mouth, in our guts, each of those communities are distinct. So the most densely populated area of our body is in the gut, so specifically in the large intestine. And we have about 39 trillion bugs that live in there. But there's a suggestion that we're actually just walking microbial DNA, essentially. because if you take all of the DNA or the genetic makeup of the bugs in our body, it's substantially more than our human DNA. So, bugs are really fantastic, especially the gut bugs, because they have really, really important functions in the body, because they help to ferment fibers. They help to release nutrients, vitamins, things like that into the system that we as humans wouldn't necessarily be able to do ourselves. So we're quite dependent on them and to be able to kind of break down our foods and produce various different things. Generally speaking, fibre is the primary source of food for the gut bugs. And there's specific type of fibre that we can't digest ourselves, but they can. And they're called prebiotic fibres. And essentially, you can get all of these things from a rich diversity of whole foods in the diet, and particularly from plant-based sources. So kind of vegetables, fruits, nuts, seeds, beans, legumes, things like that. And when we feed our gut bugs prebiotics, they essentially flourish. And they really, really thrive on as many different types of fibre as possible. And essentially, as a gift for us feeding them, they produce something called a postbiotic, which are essentially metabolites that go on then and affect body function. So some main postbiotics or metabolites that are produced by the gut include kind of short-chain fatty acids, which are really, really important for us. They include things like butyrate, propionate, and acetate. Now, butyrate is probably the most powerful. It's really, really anti-inflammatory. It has an amazing effect on the gut itself. It helps to support gut integrity. And propionate and acetate, they're also fantastic. They can go off in the bloodstream. They can go to the liver. They affect gluconeogenesis, so how we metabolize glucose. And they have really, really important impacts body-wide, essentially. It's important to kind of note that there's a strong link between microbiome health and our brain, and also our immune function, which is really, really interesting. And that has great relevance, I think, to people in sports, because some endurance athletes are actually at higher risk of things like upper respiratory tract infections and things like that. About 70% of our immune system is in our gut, in the form of gut-associated lymphoid tissue, or GALT, sometimes it's known as online. And what's really important is this kind of tissue interacts really closely with the gut microbes that are living in there. Now, if you think about it, every day that we're out and about interacting with our environment, we're kind of inhaling or ingesting pathogens and various different bits and bobs in our environment. We're also eating lots of foods and things like that. So the gut is the kind of first line of the body system that kind of is exposed to all of these things. So we really, really need to work closely with our immune system to kind of identify what's a friend and what's a foe, because you need the immune system to then be able to kind of identify what's not right, trigger an immune response if that's the case. And I think it's really important for you to have good gut health, because it's the microbes in the gut that interact with the immune system to kind of say what's going on, what needs to be watched, and kind of when an immune response needs to be generated. And unfortunately, when things go wrong within the gut microbiome, we find that the immune system goes into hyperdrive, and you tend to get a lot of inflammation. You can end up with something called a leaky gut, which I'll address a little bit later with regard to endurance sports. And that can lead to systemic inflammation, essentially. And things that are produced by the immune system, such as cytokines and things like that, they can also cross the blood-brain barrier and can cause kind of neuroinflammation as well. So it's quite significant, if you think about it, the involvement that our gut microbiome has in multiple body functions. But I really just wanted to highlight what effects it has on the immune system with regard to kind of our discussion moving forward.
Perfect. So I guess that's the relationship that the gut has with our body and how then that impacts possibly our sports performance.
Yeah.
Just kind of flipping it round, how does exercise impact our gut health? And do we see that there's a different microbiota in people that engage with more physical activity than those that aren't so active?
Yeah. So I think it's really important to just highlight the impacts of exercise on general on in the body, because exercise has such a profound impact on various different physiological mechanisms within the body. So we know that cardiorespiratory fitness kind of has a big impact on kind of heart health. It can improve lung health. It can kind of have a major impact on metabolic health, so how we regulate insulin and things like that. So it can affect hypertension, high blood pressure, and all of these things. It's so intrinsically linked. But we are now starting to realize that it can have also a profound impact on the gut microbiome. So, with regard to exercise and the microbiome, there's been a few really interesting studies. So there was one study in 2017 that was done on cyclists. And essentially what they did was they had 33 cyclists, 22 were professional, 11 were amateur. And they looked at the impact of exercise on the microbiome. And they found that exercise significantly increased the diversity of species that were living in the microbiome. And what's really, really important about increased diversity means that there's different species that are there. They have different genetics. They can impact our bodies differently because they metabolize things differently. They produce different types of metabolites, and they can impact other organisms or other bugs that are living in the gut. So species diversity is the key to success with regard to the microbiome. So it's really interesting that they noted that there was an increase in the diversity of bugs that were present. But what was really interesting about that study is that they found that there was an increase in specific types of bugs that were present. They found an increased number of Akkermansia, which is a type of bug that has been associated with obesity and metabolic syndrome. So we know that if there's more Akkermansia present in the gut, you've less obesity and less metabolic syndrome. So it's unsurprising in a sense that people who are more physically active have more of this, because you tend to see obesity and metabolic syndrome less in kind of athletes, Also, what was really interesting was that they found for the ones that had really intense exercise that exceeded more than 11 hours or so a week, they noted that there was more Provotella and there was more of an archaea or a methanogenic bug called M. smithii. Now, I
don't know how you're remembering all of these names.
They start to just stick in your mind after you read papers. But these two bugs are of real importance, actually, and this is one reason I really like this study, because Provotella, it's increased, generally speaking, in people who eat more. They have a higher calorie intake, especially with people who eat more kind of complex carbohydrates. So, unsurprisingly, it's high in athletes who would have a higher proportion of those things in their diet to kind of fuel their exercise anyway. But what's really interesting about Provotella is that it's involved in the metabolism of branched chain amino acids. And BCAAs, they're sometimes included in like different supplements and stuff like that. And people involved in the sporting industry may kind of be quite aware of things like leucine, isoleucine, valine, which are branched chain amino acids. Now, we know that they don't necessarily increase performance, but what's really interesting about BCAAs is they actually help recovery time. So they help your muscles to recover. They increase muscle turnover essentially after kind of an exercise period. So although they may not increase performance, they do help with recovery. So Provotella, who's involved in this kind of metabolism and production of these kind of branched chain amino acids, may be involved kind of in higher numbers in recovery post-exercise. And the other bug that I mentioned to you, the M. smithii, that's a methanogen. So it's involved in methane metabolism, which is basically a gas. So in the large intestine, if you're getting this bug present, there's a theory that you actually are more metabolically efficient in how your kind of gut is working. And essentially having this present reduces hydrogen in the large intestine. And we know that hydrogen actually reduces the amount of short-chain fatty acids that are produced. So essentially, its presence means that there's less hydrogen and there's more short-chain fatty acids, which we need to help our gut and to help other areas of our body. So that's the main thing about that with regard to increase in species diversity. Now, another interesting study that was done in 2014 was on Irish rugby players. I had to drop that in, obviously, because I'm Irish. But in rugby players here in Ireland, the ones that they studied, they also found that there was more acromantia, which is one of the bugs that I touched on with regard to the cyclists. So we're starting to see a pattern evolve there, you know. But what was really interesting in this study is that the rugby players that had a lower BMI had higher numbers of this bug. So essentially, we're starting to see from that study that body composition may actually be affected by the gut microbiota as well. Studies are starting to show that the amount of exercise may kind of impact the gut structure. And when you kind of stop exercising, these positive impacts on the gut microbiome actually might just vanish. So
really? So it's not long lasting?
No. And one of the studies that I was reading about this showed that essentially people who were previously sedentary and then they started engaging in endurance exercise, they saw all these benefits that kind of I was mentioning from some of the other previous studies, with an increase in species diversity, an increase in the bugs that we know are beneficial for you, an increase in the short-chain fatty acid production, which we know have positive impacts on the body. All those kind of impacts tend to kind of decrease again, because you need to maintain the exercise within a certain range to be able to kind of produce these positive impacts on the bugs. So if you then start to taper off on kind of how much exercise you're doing and go back to a more sedentary way of life, those positive impacts are going to then kind of go to the wayside.
That's a good argument to try and encourage forming healthy habits rather than doing these one-off spurts. And I guess it also goes back to the idea of these bugs are all alive. So if we had a pet, you can't feed it one day and then ignore it for the rest of the week. You just need to keep looking after these bugs and maintain that level of exercise.
Absolutely. And I really love that analogy. And I've heard a couple of fantastic podcasts over the last kind of couple of months where people are kind of talking about your microbiome as your army. So now every time I put some food in my mouth, I think, is this going to help my microbiome? Because I need my microbiome in tip-top shape to be able to kind of fuel my body. And, you know, back when I was heavily involved in athletics, like when I was a gymnast and a diver, I had no concept of how to feed my microbiome for kind of optimum performance and recovery. I just had no idea. So I think now that I know all these things, I'm like, I wish I'd known this 20 years ago.
One of the things with feeding your microbiome is I hear the number 30 a lot, and trying to get 30 fruit, veg, herbs a week. I quite like the idea that when you're feeding your microbiome, it's not restricting yourself from anything. So it's not about not having things. It's about making sure that you tick the boxes and getting your variety. So I think that is sustainable. We are able to add that variety and we can still have our treat and be feeding our microbiome. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And, you know, I think it's really important from a lifestyle point of view that we make kind of changes and work towards things that are sustainable. So kind of modifying your diet to make sure you're getting optimum nutrition. Everybody's going to fall off the wagon from time to time. But I think it's really important that if you set some trends or habits or passions for yourself that you can maintain in the long term, you're going to have a much better long-term impact on your microbiome and your health. And I think it's really interesting what you're mentioning there about the 30 species. And where that actually came from was a fantastic study over in the States. It was the American Gut Health Project, and they published a paper about 5 or 6 years ago now, where they basically did a population assessment of the gut microbiome and factors that were influencing it. And essentially what they found was that the folks that were consuming 30 or more plant species a week had a significantly better microbiome. It was associated with a better response to antibiotics because people weren't getting as much antibiotic resistance. And also mental health was improved in people who were eating 30 or more plants a week. We now know from subsequent research that the reason that this is the case is because when you consume 30 or more plant species a week, you're increasing the diversity of fibers that you're feeding the gut bugs, which increases the diversity of bugs that are actually present. I preach this so much on my Instagram page, and to anybody who listens to me, is that we really, really need to increase as much plant-based fiber intake as we can in our diet. And generally speaking, we should aim for 30 or more different plant-based species every week.
And I think often people want an easy answer, and there isn't one. It is about variety and changing up what we're eating and introducing different things into our diet. But have you got any key foods or ingredients that you really try and share with people because they're particularly high in all these things that are going to feed our gut microbiome?
Yeah. So I suppose from a general point of view, I tend to aim for plant-based diversity by including lots of fresh vegetables and fruits and things that I was talking to you about, such as beans, nuts, legumes, seeds, all of these things. It's important to get a variety from all these different categories of plant-based foods. Some really positive stuff that's coming out in the literature at the moment is that some things are particularly good from an anti-inflammatory point of view. And these are things that include broccoli sprouts and curcumin. So broccoli sprouts, they are from a cruciferous group. Obviously, the cruciferous group of vegetables includes things like broccoli and cauliflower. They contain some fantastic products. So I really recommend cruciferous vegetables to everybody. But what's fantastic about broccoli sprouts specifically is that the products that they contain, which we know have amazing anti-inflammatory properties, they're highest in the sprouting form of the vegetable. So they're substantially higher. Depending on where you read, you can read up to 50 times higher in these kind of little broccoli sprouts. And essentially, there's something called glucoraphanin, and there's an enzyme called myrosinase. And when you chew or break up these things, like these little sprouts, basically the glucoraphanin joins with the enzyme to produce something called sulforaphane. And sulforaphane is amazing because it stimulates a pathway. I don't want to get into too much science, it stimulates a fantastic anti-inflammatory pathway, which essentially causes gene expression for all these multitude of anti-inflammatory pathways and this cascade that has a profound anti-inflammatory effect on the body. So even just small quantities of these things can have a profound anti-inflammatory effect. And things like curcumin, which comes from turmeric, that has the same anti-inflammatory effect. And both curcumin and the sulforaphane from the broccoli sprouts, they act on this pathway, which is the NRF2 pathway. So generally speaking, I love fresh turmeric because it comes with all healthy oils and things like that help absorption in the body. What's fascinating about fresh turmeric is that if you actually eat it in dishes or even in a drink, you can have some in a drink. If you include a little bit of pepper, the piperine in the pepper increases absorption of the curcumin by up to 2,000%. So there's some little tricks for you.
I guess for people that are new to this, it would be easier to kind of add these small things in that have lots of benefits, at least to begin with, because 30 sounds quite overwhelming. And I know you can get that from a variety of sources and herbs and all these things that you've mentioned, but actually it can still feel quite overwhelming if someone's coming from quite a simple diet. To add that variety can be quite a challenge. So these small nuggets of information are really, really useful.
Exactly. So I think, to be honest with you, I tend to try and diversify things in every meal. I always think to myself, what else can I add into this to kind of get an extra plant point in there, you know? And I think there was a fantastic study that came out recently that showed all plants contain all of the amino acids that are essential for building blocks that contribute to protein production. Which I think is really interesting, because I think when I was kind of in sports, and even when I kind of went through my couple of years of bodybuilding, I had this obsession with protein deficiency. I was obsessed with where I got my protein. I didn't know that you can actually get all of your different types of protein that you need for really good muscle growth and recovery from plant-based sources. That's some of the studies that have been done looking at low-carb intake with high-protein diets. They detrimentally affect the microbiome. So a lot of the research that's coming out at the moment is trying to look at the balance between protein and fiber and kind of what's good for the gut. The study that I mentioned to you on the rugby players, they actually found a positive association between protein and the microbiome. But I think what's really important to note is it's really hard to kind of tease out when you're doing studies on athletes, the specifics of diet, microbiome, and exercise, and how they kind of interact is so complex. Subsequent research that's been done is suggestive that you need to be taking in adequate quantities of fiber and have that fiber diversity in order for your bugs to be able to metabolize the proteins. So if you're kind of taking in high protein for kind of fuel for your body, it's really important to also focus on the fiber sources that you're taking in, making sure that you're getting enough fiber in your diet, because personally I think that it's actually a fiber deficiency we need to be worrying about than a protein deficiency. So it's really interesting to just kind of know where you're getting your protein from, and to just know that increasing fiber intake relative to your protein is probably going to come out as something that's very important down the line with regard to nutrition in sports.
We've spoken quite a lot about optimizing the gut microbiome in terms of how exercise is beneficial, and then obviously getting your varied diet, and it's all about diversity. I think a lot of people that do engage in exercise have a lot of problems with their GI tract. So, we get runner's trot, some people call it. So people can be very prone to having loose stools, or, having to go very quickly and having increased frequency. And that can be quite difficult, I think, if you're going on a race or a long run. It's not always easy to access a toilet, and it can really, put you off your performance goals. So first of all, I guess my first question is, why do we get so many GI symptoms when we exercise?
I've talked an awful lot about the positive impacts of exercise on the gut, but this kind of endurance or really high volume training can have really transient detrimental effects on the gut. And it can cause something called Leaky Gut Syndrome, which is essentially increased permeability of the gut lining. So essentially, the gut lining is a single cell like cling film. It's a really thin lining of cells, and all these cells are held together by something called tight junctions. And essentially, what happens when we have a disruption in the harmonious balance of the gut. So if you get something called dysbiosis, when the harmony kind of the good and bad bacteria kind of is disrupted, you can get a breakdown of these tight junctions. Now, this is also seen in people who have very high training schedules and have a high volume of exercise. They also get this transient breakdown of these kind of tight junctions between the cells. And essentially what that means is if you have kind of bad bugs in the gut that are producing toxins, they're called endotoxins, they can leak out of the gut into your bloodstream, as well as kind of partially digested foods. They can go out into your bloodstream. And you then get this crazy immune response because your body's going, what the hell is this? Look at these toxins in the blood. Look at these partially digested foods. And it can mount an immune response. So you get lots of cytokines and inflammatory molecules being produced. And that can go on in people who do get this that aren't athletes. That can go on and cause chronic inflammation. But for folks that are athletes, we know that these kind of single episodes of really intense endurance activity, it can cause this transient increased permeability. And during that period, you're going to get a heightened immune response. Now, what's really interesting about this is when you kind of have a heavy burden of exercise that may last 2 or more hours. Now, I say 2 hours because we know that the body stores energy and things like that for up to 2 hours. And then after that, you're starting to put very large pressure on your body and your organs, and just the general maintenance of homeostasis or balance within the body becomes shifted. And what's really quite interesting in the studies that have come out is that there's this window after we exercise or have these endurance activities during which you can kind of get this increased permeability. But your immune system also, it can't act as kind of efficiently during that window as it usually would. Now, there's a few different mechanisms that have been proposed for this. And one that I wanted to kind of touch on today, the metabolism or the catabolism or breakdown of something called tryptophan, which is an amino acid that we use to kind of produce serotonin. But serotonin also acts locally within the gut to kind of promote motility and general functioning within the gut. So it's actually really quite important. And if we don't have the building blocks, such as tryptophan, to be able to actively produce enough serotonin, it's going to have impacts on our gut. And there was a really interesting clinical trial that was done recently, actually, looking at 33 endurance athletes. And what they tried to do was essentially supplement these athletes with a probiotic. During this kind of window afterwards, we know that immunosurveillance or the surveillance or the kind of watchdog behaviors of the immune system, they decrease. So you would be at increased risk of kind of an upper respiratory tract infection, which seems to be quite prevalent within the endurance exercise athletes. Now, what the study found, interestingly, was that the probiotic, it didn't affect tryptophan levels. But what happened was there was a self-reported reduction in the number of upper respiratory tract infections. It just goes to kind of highlight that there are pathways that are significantly affected by really intense endurance exercise. And I think from a food source point of view, it could be good to increase some tryptophan sources in your diet of food, though clinical trials are kind of needed to see whether this is going to be effective. But I always feel that, you can't go wrong when you're including good foods in your diet generally. And foods that are kind of rich in tryptophan, the highest that I've seen is spirulina. So I tend to add a scoop of spirulina, organic spirulina powder to my smoothies every day. That's really high in tryptophan. Things like chia seeds, flax seeds, and what are those wee seeds called? Sunflower seeds.
You've kind of touched on the outcomes in terms of upper respiratory tract infections. Did the probiotics affect gut symptoms at all? Did the athletes report any improvement in bowel function or bloating or anything like that?
So what's been really interesting with regard to probiotics is that there's been a couple of studies that have specifically looked at the impact of probiotics in general populations, so healthy populations of adults and children, and they really did see a decrease in infections and the duration of infections. However, studies on probiotics in athletes, the results are much more varied and, they're a bit more modest with regard to the impact that probiotics can have. However, a systematic review that was actually published in the last couple of years showed that a multi-strain probiotic with things like bifidobacterium and lactobacillus, which are two of the most readily studied bacterial strains in probiotics, that potentially could reduce gastrointestinal symptoms in athletics. And interestingly enough, there's a few different things that we can do coming up to kind of an event that may help with regard to kind of ameliorating gastrointestinal symptoms. So with regard to probiotic use, you can take probiotics running up to and during the event. And obviously, like I was saying to you, multi-strain probiotics are probably best. It's really difficult because I don't think there's enough evidence out there at the moment to kind of say one way or another whether certain strains are going to be better than others. So generally speaking, if you do want to take a probiotic, it may help for some people, it might not help for others. And it's about working with your body to kind of see what works best for you. But we do know that certain foods may trigger the gut in and around kind of an endurance event. So there's a group of foods called FODMAPs. So they're fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. So there's tons of stuff online about foods that are high FODMAP. Some people that have kind of gastrointestinal issues outside of sports, they tend to go onto low FODMAP diets, which can be really detrimental for the gut. And some people that are engaging in endurance sports tend to kind of want to have low carb, low fiber diets because they know that those things trigger them. But that's going to decrease the diversity of bugs in your diet and essentially have a long-term negative impact, which could potentially influence your recovery time and your performance. Evidence is starting to come out that if you restrict the intake of kind of high FODMAP foods 24 to 48 hours before an event, it may help with GI symptoms. Now, when it comes to the actual day of the event, generally you should have a meal 2 to 4 hours beforehand and try not to eat kind of after that up until the event. If you did want to snack, some high carbohydrate snacks that are kind of low in fiber might be best, like kind of ripe bananas or crumpets with jam and things like that have been reported to kind of be easily kind of digested early on. They're kind of quickly digested. You kind of want to avoid kind of those heavy fats, proteins, fibers that are going to go into your colon and be digested during kind of an event. Because the thing about kind of high intensity exercise is that the blood is shifted away from the gut to be able to support your heart and your brain essentially, and kind of your peripheral limbs, because we need oxygen delivered to those areas to fuel your exercise. So of course there's less blood, less energy and less things like that being driven to the gut during these events. And then obviously making sure you're nourishing your microbiome between events with really, really good diet, fiber-rich whole foods that are primarily kind of plant-based is going to really improve your microbiome in the long term.
Perfect. So I guess in summary, for those people that are going to be doing endurance events, as you mentioned, probiotics, taking them for a period of time beforehand, not just kind of turning up on race day and thinking I'll pop a probiotic and that will solve my problems. Obviously trying to get those 30 species into the diet, but then possibly changing to a low FODMAP or kind of low fiber diet in the couple of days before a race, and then also making sure we're hydrated before the event to try and prevent these GI symptoms. And then hopefully our gut has some healing effects after the event so that we can kind of return to having a less leaky gut after these big endurance events. Would that be a good summary?
Yeah, I think that's really summed it up really quite well. Like, I think just with regard to if you're reducing the FODMAP content of your diet, it's really important to reintroduce those things after, because reducing them on an ongoing basis can have quite detrimental effects on the gut. And then other things I think to kind of highlight would be, sleep is really, really important. Our gut microbiome, recent research is showing that it works on a circadian rhythm. So, the way we have we're awake during bright hours and kind of asleep during dark hours, the gut kind of works in that same pattern. So it's really important that we're getting some good sleep, time in nature, make sure that you have reduced stress levels. These are all things that are going to be really, really important with maintaining a good gut microbiome. And I think with regard to endurance athletes, if you're doing hardcore or high volume training that's kind of lasting for long periods, I think it's really, really important to kind of look at your caloric intake, make sure you're fueling your body sufficiently. And for those folks, I would really recommend going and speaking to a registered dietitian that specializes in sports and exercise medicine, because I think certain things are going to work well for some people and certain things are going to not work well, because essentially our gut microbiome is like a fingerprint. It's so individual to us. So although I might talk about all these different things and give you general overviews as to what kind of has been reported in the literature and what might work well for some people, these things won't work for everybody, So I think it's about working with someone that has a wonderful learned knowledge in this field and to kind of come up with a plan, especially a nutrition plan, to kind of train your gut to be able to kind of withstand these kind of tough going periods during high intensity exercise.
Definitely made me think I need to improve my diet a little bit and add some variety.
Oh, it's been such a pleasure chatting to you. And thanks again for a lovely opportunity to have a wonderful chat. Now, there's obviously so much more we could talk about, but these are just little tidbits, I suppose, to point people in the right direction to various different studies that have been done and just little tricks and tips that can kind of help them along the way. But hopefully lots more research will be done on the topic. Sure, you'll be treating people in sports exercise medicine in years to come with all these nuggets of wisdom.
Yeah, I'll keep sharing this. And we mentioned your Instagram a couple of times where you share a lot of information on this topic. So if people want to find out a little bit more about gut health, where can they find you?
Yeah, so essentially on Instagram, I'm the Good Gut Doc. I think with the launch of this podcast, I'll put up some reference over the next couple of weeks to the articles that I was talking about and a bit more detail about the specifics of kind of what each study found. So there'll be lots of information going up about exercise and the gut microbiome in the coming weeks. So definitely tune in there, I suppose, the best place to find out as much information as you can with regard to health and well-being.
Perfect. Thanks so much.
Thanks, and take care, Amy. Thank you so much.
I really hope that podcast was interesting and inspired everyone listening to diversify their plates and improve their gut microbiome. If you want to hear more from Anthony, then you can find him on Instagram by searching Good Gut Doc, where he shows recipes and lots of helpful information about gut health. You can also head to marathonmedic.com to find other podcast episodes in this series, as well as running routes, training ideas, and blog posts. Thanks so much for listening.